Hello, welcome ladies and gentlemen to today's tutorial. Today we want to look at the oral cavity. Remember that when we talk about the oral cavity, we are simply talking about the mouth. The mouth is where food is ingested, taken into the body. So food will have to be taken into the body through the mouth. That is where mechanical digestion of food begins. Whatever food substance that you take, mechanically will have to be broken down with the help of the teeth. It will have to be ruled, yes, with the aid of the tongue into a bolus, and of course, swallowed. Now this oral cavity actually spans all the way anteriorly from where we have the oral fissure, the fissure that you have in front of the mouth, all the way to the oropharyngeal isthmus. Now, for the oral cavity is actually divided into two sections or two parts, namely the vestibular portion and the oral cavity proper. Now, for you to know the vestibular portion or the vestibule, you just clench your teeth, and that area, from the oral fissure up to the teeth anteriorly, on either side, even to the cheeks, bounded by the cheeks, inner portion of the cheeks, and as well inner portion of the lips, you have what we call the vestibule. Now behind the teeth, as I open my mouth, where you find most of the cavity occupied by the tongue, that is the oral cavity proper. So oral cavity, apart from performing the function of mechanically breaking down food, it is also relevant in the chemical digestion of carbohydrate food by way of actually converting what we call starch into molecules with the aid of salivary amylase or Palate. And these are actually coming from what we call salivary glands. So we'll be looking in the course of this discussion, we're talking about the major salivary gland, the minor salivary glands as well. So without much ado, remember that in the oral cavity we are going to find the lip, the upper and the lower lips. Now you get to know that if I raise this one, you realize that there's a thin fold of mucous membrane, which is actually attaching the inner surface of my lip to the floor of the mouth, and that is what we call the inferior or lower labial frenulum, actually. And then the superior, there's another one superiorly, which you find it over here, thin fold of mucosa, which we will call it the superior labial frenulum. Remember that labial has to do with the lip. Again, actually for the lip, we are going to find that there will be some surface markings which are very evident. For instance, over here you see that there's a groove or sulcus over here, which is between the chin, where is the mental portion, and as well as the lip. So we call it mental labial sulcus. There's a sulcus over here. Again, there's also one here around where we have the nose, so nasal labial sulcus is also present. Again, on the upper lip, we have what we call the tubercle of the lip, which you see here. And then superiorly, you realize that the upper lip as if is divided into two. So we have this filtrum over here on either side having these columns. Now remember that if we talk about the lip, it's going to have three surfaces. Actually, we have this surface, which you have hair growing around it, which we call the external skin surface, and therefore we'll have what you call stratified, squamous, keratinized epithelial tissue. Then there is an intermediate zone, a transition zone, which we call the vermilion border or the vermilion zone. And this area is pinkish because over there we have what we call papillae. The papillae, connective tissue papillae are very much higher, and therefore the blood vessels over there actually reach the surface of the skin over here, and therefore this area tends to be pink, pinkish in nature, and that is what we see, or reddish in nature. Again, this one is also stratified squamous, actually keratinized epithelial tissue. And then of course, if you look at this area, that is the oral surface, where we have that kind of mucous membrane covering it, and therefore we have what we call oral mucosa. And this one is what stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelial tissue. So that is what we are going to find actually. And then, of course, that's the lining mucosa that you're going to find there. We also have the cheeks, okay, which also bound the oral cavity. The cheeks, again, we also have two surfaces. We have external skin surface, and then we also have, the lining mucosa also lining. We have the inner surface. And the external skin surface, of course, will be stratified squamous keratinized epithelial tissue. And then for the inner or oral surface, we will have what we call, stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelial tissue. Remember that if it is stratified squamous, then it means that protection is very important. For instance, if you take in something which is very hot, this epithelial lining is robust enough to actually help protect the oral structures. Now, of course, apart from this, we are going to find what we call the palate. Okay, remember that the palate is going to form the roof of this oral cavity, which we are going to see pretty soon. That's the palate, where we're going to find it. And the palate, you have the anterior two-thirds of it, and you have posterior one-third of it, which you are going to see them. Anterior two-thirds is actually made of bone, which we call it, the hard palate. And then the posterior one-third made of muscle, fibromuscular actually, and therefore we call it, the uvula. Sorry, we call it the soft palate, which actually ends in the uvula. So if someone opens the mouth very wide, you will see a sling of mucosal fluid which projects posteriorly downwards. We call it the uvula of the soft palate. Now, not only do we have these ones, the palate is going to form the roof. Now we're going to have the floor as well. Now the floor, we are going to find the tongue forming part of the floor of the oral cavity. We also are going to see some muscles which are going to form the floor of this oral cavity. Again, the teeth is going to form part, serving as a boundary between the vestibule, okay, and the oral cavity proper. Now, one thing that we have to know is that there will be some structures. For instance, if we talk about the major salivary glands, okay, they will have their ducts opening into the oral cavity. We are there, of course. Some of them will pierce through some muscles, which we are going to see. But for the minor salivary glands, they are numerous in the oral cavity, which we are going to look at them pretty soon. So without wasting my time, let's go through quickly what I've already talked about regarding the oral cavity. Alright, so this is what I was talking about. This is the lip. Okay, this is actually the vermilion border of the lip. Okay, as you can see. And then we are also going to have this space, okay, which is found anterior to these teeth. Those space found anterior to the teeth over here, okay, between the inner surface of the lips as well as the cheeks, is going to form what we call the vestibule of the oral cavity. The vestibule of the oral cavity. So that is one thing that we are going to find over here. Now remember that this vestibule of the oral cavity will communicate with anteriorly, okay, will communicate anteriorly with what we call the oral fissure, okay, will communicate anteriorly. So this area over here, anteriorly, actually will communicate with the oral cavity proper as you go posteriorly onto the last bit, okay, the opening, the space around the posterior to the third molar, tooth. That's where it's going to open, okay, into that area. So that is one thing that we're going to see with the oral, cavity. Now remember that I said the lip, we are going to find the upper lip and the lower lip. Now the upper lip and the lower lip, they will be surrounded by this muscle, which runs in a circular, manner, which we call it the orbicularis oris muscle. Orbicularis oris muscle. Now this orbicularis oris muscle is very important in closing the mouth. Actually we will see when we look at the muscles of facial expression. But one thing that we have to know about this orbicularis oris muscle is that it's going to mainly control the opening of this fissure, although there will be some other muscles which are going to do that, which of course we will be looking at them. So that is the vestibule. Now I said that the oral cavity, the skin around the external area will be stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelial tissue, okay, both upper and lower. And of course, this area will be the pink zone or the red zone, that's the vermilion border. Okay, we're going to find this one too. Now again, we said that the cheeks are also going to bound it. Now for the cheeks, what we find is that the cheeks will be pierced. Okay, one thing that we know, the cheek will have this muscle, which we call it vaccinator muscle. When you look at the, muscles of facial expression, you're going to see that. Now this is the parotid gland, which is going to make, less viscous, in fact, watery, saliva, and it will enter the oral cavity, actually the vestibule first, by piercing through this muscle over here, which we call the vaccinator muscle. So this is the duct of the parotid gland, which we call it Stensen's duct. So that is what we're going to see over here. It will actually open, opposite to the second, upper molar tooth, and then open into the oral cavity. So that is one thing that we're going to find. Now, when we get to the oral cavity proper, we said that the oral cavity proper is found posterior to the teeth. Okay, so over here, we are going to find the teeth. All right. Now, for the oral cavity proper, we are going to look at the roof. So the roof is formed by this palate, which also happens to be the floor of the nasal cavity. Therefore, this palate is going to have two kinds of mucosa. It will have the respiratory mucosa, which is pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissues with goblet cells, and cilia will be present as well. Then, of course, we'll also have the oral mucosa, which will be stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelial tissue, forming the oral mucosa. Now, this palate will have what we call the anterior, 2/3 of it, and a posterior 1/3 portion. Now, the anterior 2/3 has bone as its core. So we look at the histology. When we look at it histologically, then we're going to find only bone forming, the tissue. So bony. Okay. Now, this hard palate, yes, as I said, is going to be bony. Or actually, yes, you have the oral part. You have those kind of mucosal parts. Yeah, the oral mucosa. You're going to have the respiratory mucosa portion again. And this hard palate is going to have some rugae. There will be some ridges around that area, which we call it, palatine rugae. And these ones, when during taking in food, the tip of the tongue, okay, the tip of the tongue will rest, against that area. So sometimes you feel that kind of roughness. It also helps in actually mechanical digestion. So the mucosa over there, usually we call it, masticatory mucosa. We're going to have some masticatory mucosa as well. So there will be some patches of keratin. So you can also see that it will be parakeratinized or keratinized. So that's what we are going to find with the hard palate. Now, for the hard palate is actually innervated by what we call the greater palatine nerve as well as the nasopalatine nerve. And these nerves are actually branches of the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. So that's what we are going to find. Now, the next thing that we find, okay, the posterior 1/3 of it, of the roof, is formed by the soft palate. And the soft palate, yes, we said it's fibromuscular actually, and it will end in the uvula. So this is the uvula of the soft palate. Now, the soft palate, yes, what it does is that, this soft palate, during swallowing, okay, also contains some taste buds. So preventing food from entering the nasal cavity, it will close off the entrance of the posterior aspect of the nasal cavity. Okay, the internal nares or the choana will close it off so that food particles will not leave the oral cavity into the nasal cavity. So that's what it will do, and it will supplied, innervated by what we call the lesser, palatine nerve. Of course, lesser palatine nerve is also a branch of the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5. Now, for the floor of the oral cavity, the floor of the oral cavity is going to be formed by actually the tongue. The tongue is going to form parts. Remember that the tongue is also a content of the oral cavity proper, or structure which is found in the oral cavity proper. So the tongue is going to form parts. Now, when you take the tongue, what happens is that we have the rough dorsal surface. Okay, the superior surface is rough, and its inferior surface, the ventral surface, is smooth. Now remember that the ventral surface, which is smooth, will actually be anchored into the floor of the oral cavity by again another frenulum, which we call it lingual frenulum. Now, one thing that I have to say is that when you look at the palate is also endowed with salivary glands, and that is why all the time the mouth or the oral cavity is moist. These salivary glands are actually known as minor salivary glands. Now, minor salivary glands, what they do is that they produce saliva continuously, okay, to moisten the oral cavity. And one thing is that we have a lot of them, more than 700 of these minor salivary glands. So depending on where it is located, we give it name. So if it's located in the palate, we call it palatine, glands, palatine glands. Then we will find some in the oral surface of the lips, which we call labial glands. We also find some in the oral, the inner surface of the cheeks, and we call it buccal glands. Now, again, for the tongue, we also find some, and therefore we call it lingual glands. So there will also be lingual frenulum, as I said, anchoring the tongue to the inferior surface of the, to what we call the floor of the oral cavity, the tongue. Now, when you take the tongue, it's actually fibromuscular, and one thing that we find is that it has a lot of intrinsic muscles which run in different planes, okay, with these salivary glands, which I'm calling them, lingual salivary glands, okay, found in between them. So one thing that, of course, when we look at the histology, we will see that it has these glands, and these glands, they could either be of the serous type or the mucous type or seromucous, and they will be dispersed, within the muscles which run in different planes, skeletal muscles which run in different planes. Now, therefore, this tongue, as I said, is going to have two groups of muscles. It will have what we call intrinsic muscles, which are in the substance of the tongue. And these intrinsic muscles, okay, although they run in different planes, what happens is that four have been identified. We have what we call the longitudinal ones, which are over here. We have the superior and inferior longitudinal ones. Okay, apart from that, we also have what we call the transverse ones, okay, the transverse ones, and the vertical ones as well. So we have the transversely running ones as well as the vertical ones as well, forming what we call the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. Now, these intrinsic muscles of the tongue, what they do is that they change the shape. So sometimes the tongue can be bulkier, it can be very slender. So changing the shape of the tongue is by the kind courtesy of these intrinsic muscles. Therefore, I have to mention that there are also extrinsic muscles. Now, for the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, what we find is that we are going to find what we call the genioglossus muscle. Okay, so from the genu, okay, of the tongue, of the mandible to the tongue, so genioglossus muscle, that's what we are going to find over here. Yes, apart from this one, we are going to find what we call the hyoglossus. For the hyoglossus, it's not evident here, you don't see this one here. We also have what we call the palatoglossus. So remember, if it is hyoglossus, then it's going to come from the hyoid bone, okay, there's the hyoid bone to the tongue. And if it is going to be the styloglossus, it's going from the stylo process, okay, of the temporal bone to the tongue. Again, we can also have what we call the palatoglossus, and for palatoglossus, then it's coming from the palate, okay, to the tongue. So these are some of the muscles, but mainly we see what we call the genioglossus, muscle. Now, one thing is that when you look at the dorsal surface of the tongue, the dorsal surface of the tongue is divided into two: an anterior 2/3 and a posterior 1/3. So there's the anterior portion from here all the way to here. That's the anterior 2/3 and a posterior third of it. Therefore, we can call the anterior 2/3 the oral part, and then the posterior, third of it, because it's related more to the pharynx, the pharyngeal part. So the anterior 2/3 is actually having some mucosal elevation. So if your neighbor opens the mouth and you look at the dorsal surface of the tongue, you find out that we have some whitish areas, as well as some pinkish areas. Those pinkish and whitish areas represent the papillae of the tongue, and usually I call it the primary papillae of the tongue. Now these primary papillae represent, we have what we call the filiform. The filiform ones are the whitish ones, and they represent the stratified squamous keratinized epithelial tissue. They have the stratified squamous keratinized epithelial tissues. Those ones are devoid of taste buds. Now those ones which are pinkish, okay, which will include the circumvallate, will include what we call the fungiform, and of course in some cases too we have the folate. Especially folate is found more in children. So we have these ones, those represent the pinkish ones, and they contain taste buds. So when you look at the histology, you actually see what we are talking about. So that's the anterior two thirds. Now the transition from the anterior two thirds to the posterior one third is marked by what we call a V-shaped sulcus, and that V-shaped sulcus is called sulcus terminalis. Now the intersection of the V area is known as foramen cecum, and that represents where the thyroid gland, okay, actually pierced to enter what we call the neck area. Okay, that's where represents the entry of the thyroid diverticum as it entered into. So that's the foramen cecum. So the posterior one third actually contains a lot of lingual tonsils. So we describe it as having cobblestone-like appearance. So that is what we are going to find with the tongue. Grossly, we will see these ones. Now the tongue, posteriorly is having some connection to what we call the epiglottis, which is one of the cartilages of the larynx. And by way of some, so we have a median, what we call glossal has to do with the tongue, epiglottic fold. And then we also have on either side lateral glossal epiglottic fold. Now between the medial and lateral, okay, on either side, we have what we call the valleculae, the space which is over there, valleculae. So that's what we find. Now importantly, one thing is that food will have to be prevented from entering the airway. Therefore, the epiglottis will have to close off the entrance of the airway as it senses that food is coming. Therefore, the posterior aspect of the epiglottis is also endowed with taste buds. And over here, it's not really for tasting, but it's actually for sensing that food is coming, so that it closes off the entrance of the airway. So that's one thing we are going to find with the tongue. Now for the tongue, one thing too that is striking that we talk about is that yes, it's going to, we have these, let me talk about this and I'll come back to that one. Now we have these teeth. Now for human beings, we are having two sets of teeth in our lifetime. Therefore we present with what we call diphyodont dentition. You have the milk teeth or the deciduous teeth, which will get erupted in early part of childhood. Okay, and over there around that time we expect that maximum teeth that will be present will be 20. And with the dental formula, of course, talking about 2102. So that's the dental formula represent 1/2 of what we call the teeth that we find in the oral cavity. So on either side, both upper teeth and lower teeth, okay, upper part of the and lower teeth. So we are going to find, actually it's going to be for milk teeth, it's going to be 2, 1, so 2 canine. Actually for the upper we are going to have 4, actually 4, but we take 1/2 of it, so we're going to have okay, so let me just explain that. We are going to find 4, okay, teeth, okay, and then we're going to find, but for the dental formula we are going to talk about, yes, 2 for incisor, yes, 1 for canine, 0 for premolar, and of course 2 for molars. So you talk about 2, 1, 0, 2. And at adulthood, after these ones milk teeth have gotten removed, then we are going to find what we call the permanent teeth, okay, and with the permanent teeth we are going to find 32, actually after the wisdom tooth, where it's coming from, the molar aspect also comes, so we're going to have 32 teeth. So with that one, then the dental formula becomes 2 1 2 3. That's 2 incisor, 1 canine, 2 premolar, and of course 3 molar. So when you multiply this one by actually 4, you're going to get 32. Okay, so that's one thing that we talk about. Now, for these teeth, of course, we said that we are going to find incisor. Okay, we are going to find incisor. Then we're going to find, of course, canine. Okay, not shown here. So we're going to find canine. Then, of course, premolars and of course molars. One thing that is common to them is that they will have what we call crown. Okay, which is the whitish area that we see. Crown, and then we will also have the roots, which fits into the alveolar socket, which are in the mandible and of course in the maxilla. And that is why we describe the human teeth as being decodont, because decodont in the sense that it's able to insert into sockets within bones. Okay, so they show that kind of decodont dentition. Then, apart from that, the teeth are different. Of course, we talk about incisor, canine, premolar, molar. They have different morphology. Therefore, because they are different and therefore having some different functions, then we call it, having heterodont dentition. Of course, we know that the incisor is for cutting. Canine will be for tearing. Premolars and molars will be mainly needed for actually chewing. For crushing bones and what have you. So that is one thing that we have. So that's that for the teeth. That's that for the teeth. Now, one thing that we have to know is that the teeth, has the hardest substance in the body, which of course around the crown area we're going to have what we call the enamel. Okay, the enamel is the hardest substance with mineral content about 97%. Then of course we are going beneath this one we are going to have what we call the dentine. Okay, the dentine will also be there, and then of course we're going to have the pulp, where is the connective tissue portion of the tooth. So if the pulp is removed, then the tooth won't get any nourishment, because that's the connective tissue which will be supplying blood vessels as well as giving some innervation to it, so it won't be able to stand. It's going to get erupted. Then of course below where we have the roots, we are going to find the third hardest substance being the cementum. But of course we know that it's going to be anchored in the alveolar socket through the periodontal ligament. So that is one thing that we are going to find over here. Okay, we are going to find over here. Now for the tongue, as I said, the tongue will be mainly relevant for tasting, and that taste sensation will be coming from actually a branch of the facial nerve, which we call it chorda tympani. So chorda tympani, where is a branch of facial nerve, will be supplying it with the function of taste. Now mainly what we find is that the tip area, where we have the tip, will be mainly essential for tasting sweet. Of course at a rare aspect where we have a lot of the circumvallate, it's mainly going to perform the function of tasting bitter things. And of course around at the lateral aspects of the tongue, we are going to find it the sour, and of course the salty things will be tasted. But of course, one thing that we have to know is that every area of the tongue can taste any of these tastes, but mainly, okay, as I said, that's the area where you have more concentrations of the nerve fibers responsible, okay, for the taste buds, the neuroepithelial cells, mainly for certain type of tastes. There's another taste which we call it umami. Okay, that's also sometimes tasted. Any other taste is a combination of these. Four main tastes that we talk about. But one other thing that we have to know is that again, the tongue will be supplied by what we call the lingual nerve. So it's also very important that we get to know that the tongue is supplied by the lingual nerve. Now, one thing that I don't know whether I told you, but one thing is that for the extrinsic muscles of the tongue, they will be relevant for changing the position of the tongue. So mainly, that is one thing that we are going to find regarding the tongue. But one thing that we have to also know is that, although I've talked about it in one of my videos under the pharynx, one thing that we have to know is that over here posteriorly, okay, we are going to find what we call the palatal, pharyngeal arch, which forms the posterior pillar of forces over here, and then we're going to have the anterior pillar of forces being formed by the palatoglossal arch, and in between them we are going to find the palatine tonsil. So mainly these are the things that we have to know regarding the oral cavity. The oral cavity will also be relevant in breathing. So sometimes if the nostril is closed, sometimes you have to open your mouth to actually gasp for air. So that's what the oral cavity is going to do. Right? I hope this tutorial was helpful. We'll look at the histological aspects in our later section so that you get to know all these glands that we're talking about. But just to sum it up, I told you that you have what we call major salivary glands and of course minor salivary glands. For the major salivary glands, there are 3 and paired. The minor, I've talked about it. They are going to secrete saliva continuously. For the major, there are 3 and paired. 2 of them are in the floor of the oral cavity, being what we call the submandibular gland and then the sublingual gland. The submandibular gland is having a duct known as Wharton's duct, main excretory duct. And of course, we're going to have what we call the sublingual gland as well. Now remember that they have quite long, duct compared to those ones which are known as minor salivary glands. Now remember that the submandibular gland is going to produce a lot of, going to have a lot of serosecretory units compared to the mucous secretory units. About 70% serous, 40% serous, 60% serous, 60 to 70% serous, with the remaining being mucous. Then for the sublingual, we're going to have more mucus. We're going to have about we're going to have about 60 to 70% being mucus, with the remaining being serous. Then we also have what we call the Protag Gland, which I showed you over here. This is a Protag Gland, which is going to have this tensile duct. It's going to produce exclusively serous secretions, because it contains only serous secretory units, 100% serous secretory units. And this secretion is going to be rich in enzymes. So essentially, this is what we've talked about, and we'll look at the histology to get more insight in that. Thank you very much for your audience.